Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk on transit-oriented incentives and multifamily housing evidence from Los Angeles. Before we get to today's talk, let me just want to let you know that we will wrap up our fall speaker series next Friday at 12:15 p.m. when Sharon Cornelison, former Joint Center postdoctoral fellow, who's now the director of housing at the Consumer Federation of America, will be speaking about her new book, Last House on the Block: Black Homeowners, White Homesteaders, and Failed Gentrification in Detroit. Sharon will be joined in conversation after her presentation by Tony Griffin, a professor of practice and urban planning at the Graduate School of Design, who, among other things, was the project director for a 2-year project that in 2012 resulted in the creation of a long-term strategic plan for Detroit. Should be a fascinating conversation. More information about that, including how to register for the Zoom link, is available on our website. Now on to today's event. Our speaker today is Stephanie Kestelman, who is the new director of housing at Arnold Ventures, a foundation dedicated to, quote, improving the lives of all Americans through evidence-based policy solutions that maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. Before coming to Arnold, Stephanie was a doctoral student in economics, where she did fascinating, wonderful research that looked a lot at evidence-based policy solutions. Stephanie received a Meyer Dissertation Fellowship, which helps support the work that's the focus of today's talk, which examines whether and how Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities development program, which began in 2018, has affected the quantity, type, location, and timing of new housing. Stephanie will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I will be in a conversation with Stephanie, asking questions, which I hope you'll be submitting through Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. We often have more questions than we have time, but we will share all of them and your contact information with Stephanie. A video and a copy of Stephanie's slides will be posted on our website early next week. Stephanie, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much, David. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present my work. And thank you again, millionth time, for the support through the Meyer Fellowship. The analysis and conclusions I'm talking about today do not indicate concurrence by Arnold Ventures, and I'll get started. So many of you on this call know that the US faces a housing affordability crisis, and there are a lot of ongoing policy efforts at state and local levels to legalize or encourage production of new housing units. And in particular, there's ongoing effort to produce new multifamily housing units. And some states and localities have attempted to solve this problem by allowing greater density near transit by right or without having to go through long review processes, and that's what is called transit-oriented development, or TOD. So what I'm doing in this paper is I'm evaluating the impact of LA's TOD program. I look at 3 things, but 2 of them I'm not going to present today just for the sake of time. The first thing I look is the number, characteristics, and location of new units. I then look at whether the program affected land and property values, and whether the new developments that were facilitated by this program had an impact on rents. So some of you on this call may be familiar with LA, but LA is one of the least affordable cities globally, with 73% of households spending over 30% of their income on rent and utilities. And the unaffordability problem has worsened after the January 2025 wildfires. LA is also a city with historically a lot of local opposition to multifamily housing. And it's really 2 types of opposition that we're talking about. One is your typical NIMBY, don't want multifamily in my single family neighborhood. And then the other type of opposition is your supply skeptics, the folks who say new construction will make the neighborhood less affordable for people living there. What the program I'm talking about today did, programs called transit-oriented communities, was it reduced discretion, particularly local neighborhood level discretion over some multifamily projects. This project is very helpful, and I'll show you in a second why. Or it's very good for studying because the rollout was based on distance to major transit stops, which lends itself nicely to a natural experiment. And the city of LA has really good data on proposed and permitted projects. And so I'm able to look not only at what actually gets built, but at the types of projects that get proposed. I'll give you the highlight of the main findings, and then we'll get right into it. So TOC, I'll refer to it as TOC from now on. That's the TOD program in LA. It led to increase in number of housing project applications. So that's developers showing intent to build. But there's no economically significant impact on housing production. There is, however, a change in project characteristics and locations. So the program led to projects that were more likely to have income-restricted units and to be in areas that originally had higher opposition to new housing development. In an academic setting, I would usually spend a lot of time talking about how this is a contribution to the literature, but I'll just say briefly, there are not a lot of evaluations of pro-housing policies, particularly of policies that reduce discretion without formally rezoning land. So that's one of the contributions of this paper. This paper also touches on the literature on inclusionary zoning or income-restricted unit supply. And then my goal more broadly is to inform the discussion of which policies help increase housing supply. So here's a roadmap for today. I'll first tell you about my data. I'll then describe how housing is produced in LA and then what the program that I'm studying did. I'll then show you the impact of the policy on production of new housing units, and then the impact of the program on project characteristics and locations, and then I'll conclude and we'll go from there. All right, so this is probably one of my favorite things about this project, but that's just because I'm a data nerd. I assembled a very comprehensive data set of LA's full real estate development pipeline to the extent that it's tracked. So we have yearly parcel level characteristics from the property tax assessment files. And so that has number of stories, number of residential units. I then also assembled the building permits from LA Building and Safety. So that's permitted new units and permitted projects. And the building permits contain a text field that describes the project. And so I'm able to observe if the developer or the contractor has said that this is a mixed income building, or what share of units are set aside for affordable housing. I then overlay onto the building permits and the parcel characteristics zoning the zoning map from LA Planning. And then what is a pretty big innovation, at least on the academic side or on the economics side, is observing the projects before they get permitted. LA keeps track of all entitlement applications. And when I say entitlement, that means the application for the right to build a project with certain characteristics for all projects that require discretionary or ministerial review. So that includes anything that goes to the zoning board, that goes to the city planning commission, that goes to the director of planning. So, and I'll show you again in a second, it's truly most of the projects in LA that are proposed. I have project level characteristics, so I can observe if this is an income restricted project. I can observe if it's requesting a parking waiver, and I can observe if it was the application was terminated, withdrawn, or denied, and not only the approved projects. And then I go one step further and I link these projects to transcripts from zoning board and city planning hearings so that I can better understand how project characteristics correlate with local opposition, who shows up to the meetings, and what kinds of comments they're making. So LA, like many other US cities, has a zoning code. Each parcel is subject to rules related to use and characteristics. So you can only build X number of units up to a certain height with so much setback, or it's non-residential. And like many other US cities, there are two ways for projects to be approved. One is by right. So the project, say the building I'm proposing meets the standards and regulations in the zoning code, or discretionary, which means that the project is not in compliance with the zoning code, or in the case of LA, the project is building 50 or more residential units. So if we think about the process by which housing or real estate projects get approved in LA, if they're by right, they just go through this pretty easy process of you get sign off from city planning if needed, and then you get to file for the building permit. If they're a discretionary project, there's a much more involved timeline, including public hearings, likely an environmental review. The project often goes to city planning or the zoning board for determination, and the project is also subject to appeals. Discretionary approval is the most common form of entitlement approval for LA multifamily units. So this is some data from a paper by O'Neill et al. Showing that out of all the multifamily units that were approved in LA between 2014 and 2016, the vast majority of them had to undergo this longer process that I show in bullet 2. Discretionary review, as many of you may know, also delays and prevents project approval. So this graph is showing for the projects that are approved ministerially on the left, and then through discretionary review on the right, what share of the projects are approved within 1 year, within 2 years, within 3 years, or ever, or at least ever in the sample that I have. And you can see that there's a lot of delay for the discretionary project, and they're slightly less likely to ever be approved. So discretion, it's not just that there's a time cost, but there's also an uncertainty. As I mentioned, public hearings are a big input in the discretionary review process. This is just a word cloud of all the two-word pair or the word pairs that come up in the public hearings about multifamily. And you can see your usual culprits: open space, parking spaces, single family, but also you can see things like affordable housing and low income. So there is in LA and a lot of US cities, a lot of debate about facilitating and encouraging production of affordable units. And that's exactly what transit-oriented communities did. So before I talk about TOC, let me tell you about ballot measure JJJ. And if there are any Angelinos on the call, hopefully I'm not butchering this. I'm pretty sure I'm not. But measure JJJ was approved with about 64% of the votes in the November 2016 elections. And there were 2 provisions in the ballot. The first one was a requirement that all projects seeking general plan amendments or zoning changes set aside some units for affordable housing or pay into an affordable housing trust fund, and also meet prevailing wage and labor standards in the construction. And this was the bulk of the ballot and what really drove the debate. But also the text contained this provision to enable or mandate the city to create an affordable housing program for developments located near major transit stops. That was basically the whole text. And once the ballot passed, the LA Planning Department was able to just run with provision 2 and design transit-oriented communities. The guidelines for the program were not subject to city council approval because they had already been approved through the ballot. The program was backed by then Mayor Garcetti. And as I mentioned, much of the public debate was focused on the first provision, so much so that in a few months later, there was another provision another ballot measure trying to fight provision 1, but not provision 2. And if you go online and you look up what did people think about TOC when it first started, there are actually a few comments on the comment section saying these people did this by fiat, no one ever got consulted. So it truly was a big opportunity for the city of Los Angeles to try to encourage housing production without having to go through the full political process of rezoning. The guidelines went into effect in September 2017. They were released earlier in the year, I think in May, and it only applied to parcels that were zoned to allow 2 or more residential units, with a few exceptions, and within half a mile of a major transit stop. I'll tell you in a second what a major transit stop is, but the program had two prongs. The first was a density bonus or an incentive if some share of units were income restricted. And this bonus was based on AMI threshold for the income restricted units, as well as type of and distance to the transit stop. And then it also increased the threshold for discretionary review. So as I mentioned earlier, in LA, all projects building 50 or more units could trigger environmental review, as well as a public hearing and appeal, even if the parcel was zoned to allow for 50 or more units. And then after TOC, many eligible projects of 50 or more units are approved by right or only require approval from the director of planning. So there might be a public hearing, but it's not going up for vote with the zoning board or with the city council. This is just to show you what the design of the policy looked like. A major transit stop is defined here. So you have regular buses intersections, you have regular plus rapid bus, Metrolink rail stations, and then metro rail stations. The regional centers got the strongest density bonuses, but even parcels that were half a mile from from high frequency bus stops were affected by the program. And as you can see here, this is what the initial map of the policy looked like. It ended up changing over the years as buses became more frequent or new metro stations were delivered. But this is just to give you a sense of what the quote unquote treatment looked like. And this here shows you what you can see that it's a little bit different. The black lines are the map that I'm actually working with in the paper. And you can see that a lot of the parcels near major transit were eligible for multifamily, but half of them were single family and were not eligible for take-up. And that will be important when I get into why I think the program didn't have as strong of an effect as it probably could have. Okay, so if there are clarification questions, please feel free to interrupt me, otherwise I'll keep going. We're not using economics to having just time to talk. So you can see here the share of units permitted under TOC by quarter. And at one point, 60% of the units permitted were using the transit-oriented communities incentives. So there was a lot of take-up, both in the units permitted and then later on in the units completed. But if we look at the full landscape of units approved and permitted, which are these black lines and this dashed gray lines, we don't see any movement. What we do see is an increase in the number of units proposed and units approved. So the units that are not yet seeking a building permit, but that are getting approved for getting entitlement approval. This is just an aggregate. What I do in the paper is I leverage the TOC eligibility to run a quasi-experimental design or to leverage the natural experiment. So my empirical strategy in the paper compares housing production immediately inside versus outside the TOC eligibility area. So what I do is I define major transit areas or MTAs, which are the union of all half-mile radius buffers around major transit stops. So if you can see my mouse, which hopefully you can, a green blob that is connected, that is a major transit area. So this is an individual major transit area, this is another one, this is another one. And then I segment the borders into 2-mile segments to get hypergeographically specific about which parcels I'm comparing when I'm thinking about the impacts of the project. So, oh great. The idea here is that we have parcels that are in the same block, but have different treatment status from the policy. And that is what I'm leveraging as the natural experiment here. The idea is that the parcels that are right inside versus right outside are similar enough in characteristics and in zoning that truly the only thing that makes a difference in whether they get developed or redeveloped and how many units are developed is their treatment status or their TOC treatment status. So if we just looked at the raw data of units approved and permitted within half a mile of the MTA border, so inside versus outside, you can see again that there's not much happening on the units approved, on the units permitted. We still have this big increase in units approved. I can run a difference in a border difference in difference regression with the borders defined, and this is what it looks like for the regression. So for units proposed, I estimate an increase of 25 or 26 units on average being proposed on the inside relative to the outside, but there's no statistically significant effect on units permitted. I do some work in the paper to speculate why TOC had no impact on aggregate supply, and I've come up with 4 possibilities. The first one is limited developer capacity. So if there's a limit on how many multifamily units LA has the capacity to build at a given point in time, then maybe what developers are doing is they're pursuing different projects, but they're keeping the number of units or of buildings that they're working on constant. And I'll show you some evidence of that. In particular, a lot of the early take-up of TOC were projects that were existing proposals and were just converted into TOC projects. So the developer added a couple more income restricted units to a project that they had already proposed to the city. And that is where some of the take-up is coming from. It's not necessarily new projects that were ideated after the guidelines were released. The other point here, and that ties a bit into maybe the limited developer capacity, is timing. I have a table in the paper that compares the permitted versus not yet permitted applications. And the not yet permitted projects were proposed only a few months later than the permitted projects on average. But if you look at the average pre-construct or pre-permit time that it takes the developers to come up with all the plans necessary for the building permit, by the time those not yet permitted projects were ready to go, we hit COVID-19 lockdowns followed by interest rate hikes. So maybe we might have seen an impact of the policy. It was just unfortunate timing of the implementation. The third thing that I observe is that the policy made it easier to approve project plans that were not super well developed. Now, this doesn't mean that these were lower quality projects. It's just that maybe they weren't quite at the full architectural design stage. And in particular, what I see is that a lot of the applications that we see after transit-oriented communities that are claiming TOC incentives, they apply without mention of the number of units that they're proposing. So this plot here is showing the share of projects proposed with no information on number of units. And maybe what this means is just that the project or the projects still take the same amount of time from ideation to pulling the permit. And all we're seeing, the reason we're seeing so many more approvals is because we've shifted the timeline of approval earlier without shifting the amount of time that it takes a developer or their architects to come up with the plans. And then finally, there is a possibility that the program design is the reason, or I think it's a combination of all these things, but program design likely contributed. The incentives are much larger for very low income restricted units than they are for moderately low income restricted units. So maybe the AMI thresholds were too low to allow the project to pencil, or the market rate rent that the developer would have to charge was too high given the AMI thresholds that they were working with. There's also the possibility that the infill potential was kind of limited. A lot of the areas that were affected by TOC were downtown LA, and a lot of the parcels are just not prime for redevelopment. And the fact that lots zoned for single family or for low density commercial were not affected makes it a little harder to find infill opportunities. So, and then the third option is even with the regulatory relief on parking and the density bonuses, maybe it was not enough to make projects pencil. That is what I see on the aggregate supply side. But TLC did have some impacts. And so what I look at now is whether it shifted the type and the location of the projects that were built. So the first question is, did it accomplish the goal of producing affordable housing? And I'm going to use the same quasi-experiment around the borders that I just showed you. And then I'm going to look at whether the projects are being produced in neighborhoods with pre-TOC higher rates of opposition to development. So it's possible that that the program actually had no effect on units, but the units that were being developed got developed faster, or got developed at lower cost. So the first thing is I'll just show you that it increased the number of buildings with income restricted units. The program was designed to do that, and indeed it did. On the left-hand side here, we have the probability that, or the number of mixed income buildings that are being built on either side, and you can see that there's a bit of an increase, and it's statistically significant. Over here, it's about a doubling. And it's 100% increase in the number of mixed income buildings, though it's a pretty small baseline. The effect on 100% affordable buildings is a bit noisier, but we do see an effect. It is likely that they were still too expensive to develop, even with all the density bonuses. So great, we've seen that the policy was intended to produce more affordable or income restricted housing, and it did. And so now let's look at whether the projects that are getting approved would have been harder to approve had the policy not been in place. So I'm gonna have you do a bit of a counterfactual mental exercise. So the first thing that we're gonna do is assume all TOC projects would have been subject to the pre-TOC regime. So they would have gone through that whole long timeline of getting the projects approved. The question that I want to answer is, would they have been approved had they gone through that? So the way that I do this in the paper is I take a step back and I say, okay, what were the predictors before transit-oriented communities of project approval? And so I construct this object PW, which is a function of the characteristics of the project, of the site where the project was proposed, what was currently allowed by right, and the characteristics of the neighbors. And then I estimate this. I estimate this object P using all the discretionary and ministerial multifamily project applications from before transit-oriented communities was rolled out. So I have the project characteristics from the project description, as I mentioned earlier in my data section. I measured the neighbor characteristics using assessor data. So how many homes nearby are single family, how many homes nearby are duplexes, how many homes are zoned for single family. And I do this, and then I estimate this beta coefficient using a lasso regularization. More information is in the paper. I won't bore you with this. But once I have estimated the impact of all the project characteristics and the neighbor characteristics, I can then calculate this predicted probability of approval for every project before the policy was implemented. I can also do this exercise for the probability of appeal. So in LA and in many cities, you can appeal the decision as the developer if your project is denied, or you can appeal it as a member of society if the project is approved. In LA, most of the appeals are being done by neighborhood organizations, nonprofits, and individuals. So this is a sanity check that this exercise of trying to predict approval and appeal works. So what I'm showing you here is a correlation between my estimated probability of approval for a project and what people are saying and how many people are showing up to public hearings about that specific project. So on the left-hand side, we have the probability that the final decision on that project is an approval. And you can see here that the more speakers show up to the hearing, the less likely the project is to be approved. Surprisingly, mentions of parking don't really sway approval, and that might just be because everyone mentions parking. Mentions of neighborhood character and economic activity, which includes mentions of gentrification, displacement, those are also negatively correlated with approval. On the other hand, the more people show up to the meeting, the more likely they are the project is to be appealed. And we have the mirror image basically of the approval because those are opposing outcomes. So again, mentions of gentrification, neighborhood character, the project is more likely to be appealed. This holds too if I just look at negative comments in the meetings, and I describe in the paper how I do it with natural language processing and sentiment analysis. But this is the gut check for the pre-transit-oriented communities' opinions. We can see here that there is correlation between the estimated probability of approval and appeal and rejection of the project. So then I take the function that I estimated for the pre-TOC data, and then I compute the probability of approval for the projects that do use transit-oriented communities incentives. So had they been proposed under the previous regime, would these projects have been approved? Or what is the probability that these projects would have been approved? And what is the probability that they would have been appealed? So I take the project characteristics for all of the TOC incentive projects and use the mapping that I just calculated to calculate this fitted or predicted probability of approval and appeal. So these figures here are plotting the distribution of probability of, oh, I'm sorry, I should say approval here. Probability of approval and probability of appeal. You can see here that there's not much difference between the projects that use transit-oriented communities incentives, those are the blue lines, and the projects that were issued before in terms of probability of approval. If anything, it looks like they're slightly more likely to be approved. However, there is this additional mass that shows up here on the probability of appeal. And so if we test this, what this is showing you is that the projects that were proposed before TOC are slightly less likely, or sorry, the TOC incentive projects are more likely to be appealed than the projects that are proposed beforehand. So there is something to be said about the policy. Even if it didn't increase supply, it made it easier for developers to go ahead and build what are majority mixed income projects without having to go through the burdensome process of community review. So why is the ex-ante probability of appeal higher? Part of it is due to the mixed income nature of the projects. Before transit-oriented communities, projects that were seeking relief to build affordable housing were much more likely to be appealed in LA. There's also something to be said about the size of these projects. They're slightly above 50 units, so that just to clear that threshold. And that makes it, that meant that people, or that the neighbors got to have input on the approval process, and that changes after TOC. And then the last thing is that they shift in location. So the TOC projects are much more likely to be issued in neighborhoods with more renters, more households with children, lower median household income, and lower rent, which tend to be in LA, the neighborhoods that are close to mass transit. This map here is showing you what share of all units permitted after 2017 used transit-oriented communities incentives. And so you can see here, this is a big commercial corridor or a big transportation corridor, and over here as well. So I'll go ahead and conclude. Yes, I'm right on time. So I find that the program didn't meaningfully increase the number of units permitted, but it enabled a different kind of development, more income restricted buildings, often in lower income majority renter neighborhoods with higher expected opposition. And the expected opposition tends to be this anti-displacement kind of opposition. The muted effect on supply is partly due to timing and partly due to the design of the program. We don't have a counterfactual where COVID didn't happen and interest rates didn't go up, but that would have been a great thing to take a look at. However, we do see an increase in the number of project applications, particularly less complete ones. And it'd be interesting to see if any of them are being developed or start getting developed as the interest rate environment starts to change. As David said, we don't have time to get to all the questions. Feel free to reach out to me. This is my email, and I look forward to the discussion.
Stephanie, thank you. And I think what you've done just in terms of assembling the data is really extraordinary, and I think in many respects is out on the cutting edge for how we're going to be doing housing research going forward. And I know it's something that you and Arnold Ventures are very much into. We've gotten a bunch of interesting questions. I have a few of my own. Let me just start. There were a couple of people just asking for some clarification, and two in particular. One, can you just repeat the connection between multifamily zoning and the TOC? Because I think it's an important point that this, unlike a lot of other things. And then the other, can you just provide a few more details about the regulatory, about what you have to do to get the regulatory relief and the nature of it, particularly what's the parking bonus, and what is the definition here for affordable units? I think you touched on it, but I think it's worth fleshing out.
Yeah, let me talk about the TOC and multifamily for a second, and then I have some slides in the back so I can just show those for the guidelines. Sorry, I'm pulling them up. Hopefully this will work. Actually, I'll do it in reverse. So the way that a project would qualify for TOC is they would submit this application. Hopefully you can see. So you would say, this is where the project is located. And then you say location of the major transit stop. That's how you qualify. Here you can show the eligibility. And then these are the tier benefits. So again, it varied by type of transit that you were close to and distance to that transit. So you can see we have for the closest to the furthest away from two buses that come often enough during rush hour, you get 50% units over base. The reduction of parking from 1 per bedroom to half per bedroom, and then this FAR increase. And then this is all in the TOC guidelines, and I'm happy to talk more about this. And then the restricted affordable units requirement it depends on the threshold that you set. So for tier 1, for example, you either need 8% of all dwelling units to be affordable to extremely low income households, which is defined using AMI and the HUD data, or 11% for very low, or 20% for lower. And you can see here that it changes a lot. So a lot of projects, I actually have seen no projects that use the lower income. Most of them are using ELI or VLI for their threshold, for their income restricted units.
but importantly there, and I think I remember this from reading through the paper, we're talking about people in the sort of 30 to 80% of AMI. A lot of inclusionary zoning programs are kind of 80 to 120%.
Right.
And this goes back to your point about penciling out, and I'll come back to it in a second.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've heard from talking to folks is that a lot of these units they sit empty. A lot of the income restricted units sit empty because it's hard to find that match of a 30 to 80% AMI or 30 to 50% AMI to rent in some of these buildings.
Mm.
The question about TOC and multifamily. So this is recorded, and I'll say it anyways. My understanding from talking to the folks in planning is that single family homes or zoned areas were not to be touched. And so the program, when it was designed, only affected either multifamily or area zoned for multifamily or zoned for commercial or manufacturing that allows multifamily housing.
And that actually leads to at least two people have asked, what's your understanding of how this is going to interact with SB 79, which is a statewide transit-oriented development law? Sorry to folks if we think we're going too far in the weeds, but this is where
No, no. I got a question about, or there's a request about the slide deck becoming available. It will be available when the meeting recording is out. So I'm just repeating that. So that is a good question. Part of my understanding from talking to folks in LA is that SB 79 just kind of supersedes this. One of the reasons the program also likely did not create that many units is by the time developers were ready to build, ED1 had also come out. And so I actually see a big shift in projects that were requesting TOC incentives to asking for ED1 incentives.
I'm sorry, ED1 for folks who don't know.
It's another transit-oriented policy that California passed a number of years ago. I think it was 2019. And so that is part of, I don't want people to understand the findings of my paper as transit-oriented development or transit-oriented incentives don't work. That is absolutely not the bottom line of the paper. The bottom line is that this particular program did not generate a lot of units. And I think part of it is because there's so much happening in California, an interaction of local and state, that, I mean, we saw that the policy didn't generate units in aggregate, so it's not like other programs were generating units during this time. But there is just a lot happening in the California landscape, and developers might be taking more of a wait and see approach. And if the TOC passes today, who's to guarantee that there's not a stronger version of the policy that passes in 2 years or 3 years? And so maybe that's something that's happening. One of the follow-up steps that I'm planning to take is to look at whether developers are buying land and holding, and I can use the transactions data to see if they're doing that. And I have some thoughts on how to do that. But
you lead me to two questions, and I'm trying to figure out the right order. So why don't we start? So you have a really large number of projects that have gotten approval but haven't pulled a permit. Do you have any? Is that approval forever? What do you think is going to happen? Or is there some value to having that approval?
So there is some value to having that approval. TOC in its current iteration is set to expire next year. And I think there are conversations in LA about extending or improving or making changes to the program. So if the program ends altogether, then the approval is worth nothing. If the approval is set in line with SB 79, then maybe the developers who got those approvals are just hanging on to projects that are designed and they just get to go ahead and build under a different policy. But Yeah, that was something that I thought a lot about, whether this was the approvals part was just the developers have option value from getting the approval, and then they get to wait and see. And that is some of what I see. But I also think some of it is fear that the program would go away, and that they could hang on to the approval at least for a little while.
And if the second part of that question, given that the program is due to expire, um, if you were offering some advice
Mm.
to policymakers in Los Angeles who are struck by, we've approved a bunch of projects, but we haven't gotten permits. What would you suggest they look at in terms of tweaks? And I guess the related question is for policymakers in other places around the country thinking about this, what do you take away as I guess both positive lessons, but also things that they might want to tweak if they were um, thinking about adopting a similar policy? Is that clear?
Yeah, that is clear. That's a good question. And I'm always, as a previous academic, I'm always a little reticent to give advice. Um, I think I think the
What trade-offs do you think they should be considering?
no, that's a good way of asking that question. Thank you. I think the income threshold for the income restricted units is a big part of this, and maybe the extremely low income threshold, which gives the highest density bonus, is just too low for the and maybe it's not even just the threshold, right? Is the developer having to operationalize a wait list for these units. Uh, so I think that's part of it. I think the political climate is such that maybe it's easier to include the single family zoned lots, or lots that have had ADU construction, or if a lot allows for ADUs, then maybe it should also allow for a density bonus like this. And really what that would look like is 3 units instead of two. So we're not talking 50 units in a single family neighborhood. I think the other thing is, because this is based on major transit stops, and the major transit stop depends on bus lines and depends on metro lines. And I don't have evidence for this, but there was some uncertainty over which parcels qualified, especially if the parcel is within the major transit area of buses and not metro, which can switch. Uh, so maybe there was, I think having a map that is a little bit more stable. The TOC map changed quite a few times during my study period and during its existence. So I think having a map that is a little bit more stable helps give developers a lot of certainty. And then the other part of this trade-off is just development is expensive. And there are a couple factors that local governments can't really address. Um, and I'm not sure they should be trying to address the cost of financing, for example. But on the other hand, if the expectation is that you're going to get housing, and my biggest fear as someone who is pro housing and studies these policies is that people misconstrue the evidence as policies don't work to generate more housing, and that is absolutely not what I'm saying here. And so, and that people would in particular construe the lack of units being built in this current interest rate regime that we're living in and cost regime that we're living in as evidence that things won't work.
A couple of clarifying questions. Just on the income restricted units are not getting some other subsidy. They're essentially the developer is expected to be cross-subsidizing them from the rents in other units.
Yeah.
And that
For the mixed income buildings.
for the mixed income buildings, yes. One of your findings, if I think I heard this right, that really struck me was that you were seeing more development of mixed income buildings in poorer neighborhoods. Yeah. And I'm trying to, I guess I found myself wrestling with, um, was that expected? Is that something that is viewed positively or negatively? Like I'm trying to make sense of that outcome, because a lot of our housing policies are, how do we create mixed income in more affluent neighborhoods?
Right. So I think the first thing is the policy only applies to lots zoned for multifamily or that allow multifamily. By by law and construction, we've made it so that a lot of the higher income neighborhoods are entirely or mostly zoned for single family. So it's not the fact that most of the construction is happening in lower income neighborhoods. And when I say lower income, I'm not saying these are bottom 10th percentile of the income distribution. It's below median in LA, uh,
Mhm.
which simply just means that they're not zoned for single family. So that's part of the correlation. But if you look at the map, a lot of the units are being built along a transit corridor that tends to have a lot of not low income, but working class families. On the one hand, right, we want to produce mixed income housing in neighborhoods where people have the opportunity to access schools and and services and economic opportunity. On the other hand, we have working class neighborhoods that are using public transit for transportation, and the housing supply is limited. And so people end up getting displaced because they can't find, like, your children can't find housing in that specific neighborhood, or your nurses and firefighters. And so there is, and they're not necessarily using the income restriction. They're often renting market rate units. Um, so what a program like TOC does is it just makes sure that there's increasing supply, or what it was intended to do was increase supply near transit and to make it easier for folks to stay. Um, it's not, I mean, I showed you the evidence that it didn't really do much. Much of what it did was, as I said, take projects that would have been built and build them under the program. Um, and a lot of these projects were likely going to be built entirely as market rate housing. And now they also have this income restricted component. So if they were going to be built in those areas anyways, with no income restriction, I'm this is a lot of ifs. I don't have a good answer to the question of should we be incentivizing it to be in a specific area. Anything that is transit oriented, just by the way American cities have been built over the past 50 years, will have transit more accessible either in downtowns or in lower income neighborhoods, just because wealthier people have selected out, except for the cities where it's now an amenity to have access to transit. And then in that case, it might be an anti-displacement tool. But maybe we don't, and that's maybe where the affordable housing requirement or inclusionary zoning might play a bigger role.
I think I know the answer to this question, since I used to do transportation policy, but do we know anything about, and it may be just too soon to tell, or we don't have the data, about whether the travel patterns of people who are actually living in either in these buildings, or if we've seen anything in terms of changes in travel behavior in the affected neighborhoods?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. I tried at some point to get data on parking and just and car use in some of these neighborhoods, and whether, because there's so many parking
Yeah.
waivers. But I don't have the answer to that. There is another paper out there that is looking at who moves into these buildings. Um, and if folks want to,
And no, actually, there was a question about that. So keep going.
well, so it's not my paper.
Yeah.
And I don't recall the findings exactly, but they're mixed income buildings, so they are mixed income
Yeah.
groups that are moving in. In some of A lot of the people that are moving into these buildings look like the people that were moving into these neighborhoods in general. Um, it's a little harder to see who stays, but the evidence on, call it gentrification, call it displacement, is kind of limited. Limited in the sense that there's not much evidence of it, not that there is no the
Yeah,
evidence is that there's not much evidence.
right. And as you think about, it's sort of a two-part question. Um, I don't know, as far as you know, has anybody done a similar kind of analysis for other places that have done a serious transit-oriented development? And the corollary of that is, are kind of where do you hope to take this research next, either on your own or in Arnold as somebody who might be facilitating some of this research?
Yeah, so I'll put on my Arnold hat for 2 seconds, my AV hat for 2 seconds. One of my priorities as Director of Housing Research is to fund high quality policy evaluations. So if you are out there and you have a background in social sciences and doing quantitative research, please reach out to me. There are a lot of states that are passing transit-oriented development laws, including Massachusetts. I think for some of these places, it's too early to see anything being generated. But we see in, I don't know, in Revere that there's a lot of development happening around major transit stops. So there's a preference or there's an incentive, but clearly there's some demand for using those upzoning benefits. Taking off my AV hat and going back to my own research, I would love to know a little bit more about what the developers are doing here. Are they buying the land when they apply, or are they just submitting applications? It's unclear if you needed to own the plot of land that you were applying to get an entitlement for. The entitlement wasn't transferable, but if you're trying to buy a piece of land and you don't need to own it, then maybe there's some benefit to try to get the approval before you're getting the land. So I that's something that I want to look at. And then the other thing that I really want to look at is just extending my time series a bit. And I don't think TOC itself is generating units in LA. But SB 79, I have this data. I would love to use it to look at other things. I can observe ADU construction, legalization of previously unregulated dwelling units. So there's a lot of work to be done in evaluating the vastness of pro-housing policy, which is a great thing. I'm glad we're implementing all these policies and we figure out which ones are working and which ones are not. The one thing that I'll say, when TOC was implemented, and this is not a dig, but the data portal for the city of LA's planning department basically shows this program as a great success because you see the take-up rate and the number of projects that are using this policy, and it looks like the policy is doing a lot, but it doesn't show the aggregate, and that's where the devil lies there, right? We're seeing substitution, we're not seeing an increase in development. So for any policymakers out there, if your data is easier to use, there are more people out there who can do things like what I'm doing, and like what many other folks out there are doing in terms of accessing the data, linking it in cool new ways, using all these sophisticated LLMs and natural language processing tools to learn more about what's happening, using the text as a source of information. So that's my other plug, is make it easier for us to do research by making your data easier to access.
Well, we've gotten to that point where we've got many more questions, but no more time. I want to make a couple of observations and also to let folks know. Stephanie's the paper is actually already posted on Stephanie's website. The Joint Center will be posting a version of this paper within the next couple of weeks. Stephanie's been drafting a blog that summarizes a lot of those findings and what she said today. So as I said, Stephanie's slides and a video of this will be posted by early next week, and I expect before Thanksgiving, if not sooner, you'll also be able to read the full paper and link off of our website. And just to pick up on your last point, um, we at the Joint Center take seriously a couple of elements. We take our mission quite seriously, which is to try and foster informed debate around housing issues, particularly the housing policies and programs that'll strengthen and foster diverse communities. We also take seriously the mandate to try and foster the next generation of leading researchers and policymakers. I can't think of a better example of how that all comes together than this work, including where you ended, which was the way to build, to do this in part involves partnerships with all levels of government around data, around being willing to ask hard questions and sometimes come up with answers that are surprising and perhaps even troubling, but to really think them through. I am just um, thrilled that the Joint Center has been able to encourage this research and as with you and your boss, Jenny Schutz, who's researched the Joint Center, helped support, oh my goodness, 2 decades ago. I think it's just a great example of what we are hoping to do and look forward to many years of doing it with you to come. Um, so I hope those of you online will please join me in thanking Stephanie, and I'm sure you at some point will be back at a different Joint Center webinar. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, David.